The hallways of Westfield Conservatory buzzed with the usual Monday morning energy. Students rushed to practice rooms, instrument cases bumping against their legs, sheet music clutched in their hands. The historic building, with its high ceilings and walls that had absorbed decades of musical triumphs and failures, seemed to hum with anticipation for another week of rigorous training. Among the crowd walked Elena Chen, her steps measured and uncertain. Unlike the others who moved with the confidence of belonging, Elena's eyes darted around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. At 19, she was starting mid-semester at one of the country's most prestigious music schools, something almost unheard of at Westfield. Elena pulled her oversized sweater closer as if trying to make herself smaller. Her long black hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a worn backpack rather than the expensive bags many students favored. Nothing about her suggested extraordinary talent. In fact, everything about her screamed ordinary, from her plain clothing to the way she kept her gaze lowered when passing groups of chattering students. The administration office was tucked away at the end of the main corridor. Elena took a deep breath before pushing open the heavy wooden door. Inside, a woman with gray-streaked hair looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the clipped efficiency of someone who had answered the same questions for decades. "I'm Elena Chen." "Today is my first day," Elena said softly, her voice barely audible over the distant sound of a violin being tuned somewhere down the hall. Recognition flashed across the woman's face. "Ah yes, the mid-semester transfer. Professor Hargrove is expecting you for your placement evaluation." She checked her watch. "You're 15 minutes early. Take a seat." Elena nodded and settled into one of the stiff-backed chairs against the wall. Her fingers tapped a silent rhythm on her knee, not nervousness but muscle memory, as if she were playing an invisible keyboard. The door to the inner office swung open, and a tall man with a stern face appeared. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his posture was as rigid as if he had a metronome for a spine. Professor Richard Hargrove had led Westfield's piano department for 20 years, and rumors among students said he hadn't smiled for at least 15 of them. "Miss Chen?" His eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, assessed her quickly. "Come in." Elena followed him into an office lined with shelves of music books and framed photographs of Professor Hargrove with famous pianists. A baby grand piano occupied nearly a third of the room. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the piano bench while he took a seat behind his desk. "Your transfer application was unusual. We rarely accept students mid-year." Elena nodded. "I'm grateful for the opportunity, sir." "Your previous training?" His pen hovered over a form. "Just some lessons growing up." "Nothing formal," Elena replied, her eyes briefly flicking to the piano keys before returning to her lap. Professor Hargrove's eyebrows rose slightly. "And yet you applied to one of the most competitive music conservatories in the country." "Music is important to me," she said simply. The professor sighed, making no effort to hide his skepticism. "Well, let's not waste time. I see you've registered for intermediate piano rather than beginner. Play something to demonstrate your current level." Elena hesitated before placing her hands on the keys. Her fingers hovered for a moment, then began a Chopin nocturne. She played with deliberate imperfection. A slightly uneven rhythm here, a missed note there, her posture just a bit too stiff. To the untrained ear, it would have sounded quite good. To Professor Hargrove, it sounded like a student with some natural ability, but insufficient training. He made several notes on his form. "Stop, please." Elena's hands immediately lifted from the keys. "Try this," he said, placing a sheet of music in front of her. It was Bach's Prelude in C major, a piece often used to assess technical fundamentals. Elena glanced at it and began to play. Again, her performance was careful, competent but deliberately flawed. She added hesitations where there should be none, as if she were reading the music for the first time, though her eyes barely moved across the page. Professor Hargrove watched her hands with narrowed eyes. Something didn't quite fit, but he couldn't place what it was. After she finished, he tapped his pen against his desk rhythmically. "You position your hands like someone with years of training, yet you play like someone who practiced without proper instruction," he observed. Elena looked down. "I watched a lot of videos online to learn the right way to sit and hold my hands." The professor's mouth tightened. "Videos cannot replace proper instruction, Miss Chen. That's precisely why serious musicians attend conservatories." The door opened, and a younger woman with curly brown hair poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, Richard, but the department meeting starts in 5 minutes. "Thank you, Ms. Walsh. This is Elena Chen, a new student in the intermediate piano class. She'll be in your Tuesday-Thursday section." Ms. Walsh gave Elena a quick professional smile. "Welcome to Westfield. I look forward to working with you." After she left, Professor Hargrove stood signaling the end of their meeting. "Ms. Chen, I've approved your placement in the intermediate class, though I have reservations. Westfield maintains extremely high standards. If you cannot keep up, you will be moved to the beginner level." "I understand," Elena said quietly. "Thank you for the opportunity. The practice rooms on the 3rd floor are available to students from 6 a.m. to midnight. I suggest you make extensive use of them." He handed her a schedule and a stack of forms. "That will be all." Elena left the office with her head down, clutching the papers to her chest. As she walked away, Professor Hargrove and Ms. Walsh watched through the office window. "Another scholarship student?" Ms. Walsh asked. "Yes. The diversity committee was impressed with her application essay," Professor Hargrove said, his tone making it clear he hadn't been. "She has some natural ability, but nothing exceptional. I'm not sure why she's here and not at a state school music program." "Well, we've seen late bloomers before," Ms. Walsh offered. "Rarely," he replied. "And not at 19. By that age, real talent has already announced itself loudly." The following day, Elena arrived early for her first class. The intermediate piano studio was a large room with multiple upright pianos around the perimeter and a grand piano at the front. She chose a seat in the back corner and waited as other students filed in, many of them greeting each other warmly, their conversations filled with inside jokes and shared experiences. A boy with tousled brown hair dropped into the seat next to her. "You're new," he said, not a question but an observation. "I'm Zach, 2nd-year piano performance major." "Elena," she replied with a small smile. "Just transferred. Mid-semester?" "That's rough," he said sympathetically. "Walsh is okay, but watch out for Hargrove. He expects perfection." "I noticed," Elena murmured. Ms. Walsh entered the room and the chatter immediately died down. "Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our new student, Elena Chen. Elena, would you stand briefly so everyone can see you?" Elena reluctantly rose from her seat, feeling the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on her. She gave a small wave before quickly sitting back down. "Now let's continue with our study of Romantic-era techniques. Last week, we discussed the importance of rubato in Chopin's works. As Ms. Walsh lectured, Elena took careful notes, though occasionally her pen would pause, and she would stare into space, her fingers making tiny movements against her thigh. Zach noticed but didn't comment. When the time came for students to practice on the pianos, Elena was assigned to an upright in the far corner. She played the assigned exercises with deliberate care, making the same kind of small, calculated mistakes she had in her evaluation. Occasionally, she would glance around to see if anyone was paying attention to her, then subtly adjust her technique to appear less proficient. Near the end of class, Ms. Walsh made her way around the room, listening to each student briefly. When she reached Elena, she listened for a minute before stopping her. "Your hand position is excellent, Elena, but you're rushing the middle section. Try again and remember to count." Elena nodded and restarted the passage, this time playing with slightly more hesitation. Ms. Walsh frowned. "No, that's too cautious now. Find the middle ground. Like this." She demonstrated on a neighboring piano, her fingers flowing smoothly across the keys. "I'll practice more," Elena promised. After class, as students gathered their belongings, Ms. Walsh approached Elena again. "Have you found the practice rooms yet?" "Yes, ma'am. I was there until closing time yesterday." "Good. You have potential, but you'll need to work harder than most to catch up. Everyone else has been here since September." Elena nodded earnestly. "I understand. Music means everything to me." As she left the classroom, Elena didn't notice Professor Hargrove watching from the doorway, his expression thoughtful and slightly troubled. There was something about this unremarkable new student that didn't quite add up, and Richard Hargrove had spent his career trusting his instincts about musical talent. That evening, while other students went to dinner together, Elena slipped into the smallest practice room on the 3rd floor. She closed the door, set her backpack down, and finally allowed her shoulders to relax. Sitting at the upright piano, she placed her hands on the keys but didn't press them. Instead, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. as if reconnecting with something long buried. Only when she was certain she was completely alone did she begin to play. Not the simple exercises from class, but the opening bars of a complex Beethoven sonata. Her fingers moved with a precision and confidence entirely absent from her earlier performances. Then, catching herself, she deliberately fumbled a passage, smiled sadly, and began practicing the basic exercises she had been assigned, carefully inserting small errors that only the most attentive ear would recognize as intentional. Outside the practice room, the janitor paused briefly, mop in hand, listening to what sounded like two different pianists playing, one gifted, one struggling. Shaking his head at the strange acoustics of the old building, he continued on his way, leaving Elena alone with her secret. 3 weeks passed quickly at Westfield Conservatory. For most students, time was measured in practice sessions, theory classes, and the countdown to their next performance. For Elena, it was measured in how long she could maintain her carefully crafted persona of mediocrity. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of the intermediate piano studio as students took their usual seats. Elena slipped in quietly, choosing the same corner spot she'd claimed since her first day. She had become known as the quiet transfer student, polite, hardworking, but unremarkable. Ms. Walsh entered with a stack of sheet music and a determined expression. "Good morning, everyone. Today we'll be working on your pieces for the departmental evaluation next month." The room filled with groans and nervous laughter. The departmental evaluations were notorious, a chance for the entire piano faculty to judge students' progress and sometimes decide their future at the conservatory. "I've selected pieces that will challenge each of you appropriately," Ms. Walsh continued, beginning to hand out sheet music. When she reached Elena, she paused. "For you, I've chosen Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, first movement. It's challenging but should be within your capabilities if you put in the work." Elena accepted the music with a small nod. "Thank you. Let's begin with some technique exercises, then we'll break into practice sessions. I'll come around to work with each of you individually." The class moved through their warm-ups, scales cascading through the room in waves of sound. When they separated to practice, Elena found herself at an upright piano near the window. She began working on the Beethoven piece, intentionally stumbling over passages she could have played perfectly in her sleep. After 20 minutes, Ms. Walsh appeared at her side. She listened for a moment, her frown deepening with each bar. "Stop, please," she said, her voice sharper than usual. "Elena, have you been practicing at all since our last class?" Elena looked up, feigning surprise. "Yes, every day." "Then I don't understand why you're struggling with the basic timing here. This section should flow like water, but you're playing it like you're wading through mud," Ms. Walsh demonstrated, her fingers moving gracefully across the keys. "I'm sorry," Elena said softly. "I'll try harder," Ms. Walsh sighed. "Try isn't enough at Westfield. You need to deliver." She moved away to the next student, leaving Elena alone with the sonata that she was pretending not to master. From across the room, a few students exchanged glances and whispers. Zach, who had been friendly to Elena since her arrival, shot them a disapproving look before returning to his own practice. At the end of class, Elena gathered her belongings slowly, aware of Ms. Walsh watching her with disappointment. As students filed out, Elena heard snippets of conversation. How did she even get in mid-year? Probably some diversity scholarship thing. I heard Hargrove doesn't think she'll last the semester. Elena kept her eyes down, letting the words wash over her. This was part of her plan, to be underestimated, to be invisible, to relearn music on her own terms without the weight of expectations. She was nearly out the door when Ms. Walsh called her back. "Elena, a moment, please." Elena turned, clutching her music to her chest. "Yes?" "I'm concerned about your progress," Ms. Walsh said bluntly. "You show moments of understanding, but then it's as if you deliberately hold yourself back." Elena's heart raced. Had her act been too transparent? "I'm just nervous," she offered, "especially when people are listening." "This is a performance school, Elena. Everyone is always listening." Ms. Walsh studied her for a moment. "I've scheduled you for an extra session with Professor Hargrove tomorrow. Perhaps a different teaching approach will help." Elena's carefully maintained composure slipped for just a second. "Professor Hargrove?" "But no arguments. 4 p.m. in his studio." Ms. Walsh gathered her papers. "I want you to succeed here, Elena, but you need to put in the effort." The next afternoon, Elena walked slowly to Professor Hargrove's studio, dread settling in her stomach. One-on-one with the department head would make it much harder to maintain her deception. She knocked softly on the door. "Enter," came the curt response. Professor Hargrove sat at his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed some papers. He didn't look up immediately. "Miss Chen, sit at the piano, please." Elena did as instructed, positioning herself at the baby grand with perfect posture, then quickly adjusting to make it slightly less perfect. "Ms. Walsh tells me you're struggling with Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata," he said, finally looking at her. "A piece many of my beginning students can play adequately." "I'm trying to get the feeling right," Elena said, staring at the keys. "Feeling comes after technique." "Miss Chen, let me hear what you've prepared." Elena began to play, deliberately making the same mistakes she'd made in class, hesitating at the arpeggios, rushing through some passages, slowing awkwardly through others. She could feel Professor Hargrove's eyes on her hands analyzing every movement. After 2 minutes, he held up a hand. "Stop." The silence that followed was heavy. Professor Hargrove removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Miss Chen, do you take me for a fool?" Elena's head snapped up. "No, sir." "Then perhaps you can explain why a student who positions her hands with years of classical training suddenly plays like someone who has never taken a proper lesson." His voice was calm but laced with irritation. I told you. I watched videos. Yes, the online videos." He waved his hand dismissively. "I've been teaching piano for 35 years. Miss Chen, I know the difference between self-taught mistakes and," he paused, searching for the right word, "manufactured ones." Elena sat frozen, her plan unraveling before her eyes. Professor Hargrove stood and walked to the piano. "Play it again. This time don't insult either of us with this charade." Elena hesitated, then placed her hands on the keys again. She played the opening bars of the sonata, still with some deliberate imperfections but fewer than before. "Better, but still not honest," Professor Hargrove said. "Why are you here, Miss Chen? There are plenty of music programs that would welcome a student of your modest abilities." "Why Westfield?" The question hung in the air. Elena's fingers rested on the keys, not playing but not retreating either. "I need to be here," she finally said, her voice barely audible. Professor Hargrove studied her for a long moment. "Well, you won't be for much longer if you continue at this level. The departmental evaluation is in 3 weeks. Ms. Walsh feels you're not taking your assignment seriously." He returned to his desk and wrote something on a form. "Perhaps what you need is proper motivation. Instead of the Moonlight Sonata, you will perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 for your evaluation." Elena's eyes widened. Even for advanced students, Rachmaninoff's Third was considered one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. "But that's challenging?" "Indeed." Professor Hargrove's expression was unreadable, perhaps impossible for someone at your level. "Consider it an opportunity to show us what you're truly capable of, Miss Chen, or to admit that you don't belong here." He handed her the sheet music, pages and pages of complex notation that would make most piano students break into a cold sweat. 3 weeks, he repeated. "You may use any practice room anytime they're available. I suggest you start immediately." Elena took the music with slightly trembling hands. "Yes, sir. You're dismissed." She left the office in a daze, clutching the Rachmaninoff score. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Zach, who was coming out of a practice room. "Whoa, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He glanced at the music in her hands and whistled low. "Rach 3? That's not your evaluation piece, is it?" Elena nodded numbly. "That's insane. Even the advanced students don't tackle that until their final year." Zach looked genuinely concerned. "Who assigned that?" "Professor Hargrove," Elena said quietly. Understanding dawned on Zach's face. "They're trying to push you out." Elena didn't respond, but her silence was confirmation enough. "That's messed up. Look, I can help you practice if you want. I mean, I can't play it either, but maybe together we could—" "Thank you, but I need to do this myself," Elena said, a new resolve entering her voice. Zach looked skeptical but nodded. "Okay, but if you change your mind." That evening, word spread quickly through the piano department. By dinner time, everyone knew that the unremarkable transfer student had been assigned an impossible piece for her evaluation. Some students found it cruel. Others thought it was justified. Most were simply curious to see what would happen. In the faculty lounge, Ms. Walsh confronted Professor Hargrove. Rachmaninoff's third? Richard, that's excessive. You're setting her up to fail. Professor Hargrove sipped his tea calmly. Am I? I'm not so sure. She can barely handle the Moonlight Sonata. It's almost vindictive. There's something off about her playing, he said thoughtfully. Something that doesn't add up. This will either reveal what she's hiding or confirm she doesn't belong here. Either way, we'll have our answer. Ms. Walsh shook her head. I hope you know what you're doing. Meanwhile, Elena had found her way to the smallest practice room on the third floor, the one furthest from the main hallway, with a door that closed more securely than the others. She sat at the upright piano, the Rachmaninoff score open before her. For the first time since arriving at Westfield, she allowed herself to play without restraint. Her fingers flew across the keys with precision and power that would have shocked her professors. The complex rhythms and demanding technique of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece flowed from her hands as naturally as breathing. She played until her shoulders ached, until the sky outside the small window turned dark, until the only sounds in the building were her music and the occasional footsteps of the janitor making his rounds. When she finally stopped, she closed the score and sat in silence for a long moment. Then, with deliberate care, she played a simple scale, inserting a small mistake in the middle. A sad smile crossed her face as she packed up her things. The challenge had been issued. Now she had to decide, continue the charade or finally reveal who she really was. Word spread through Westfield Conservatory like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew about the impossible challenge Professor Hargrove had given to Elena Chen. Students whispered in hallways, some with sympathy, others with barely concealed satisfaction that the mysterious transfer student was being put in her place. Elena arrived at her morning theory class to find curious glances following her. She kept her head down, sliding into her seat just as the professor began the lecture. Throughout the class, she took meticulous notes, though her mind was elsewhere, calculating practice hours, planning her approach to the Rachmaninoff piece, and considering just how much of her true ability she was willing to reveal. As she left class, Zach fell into step beside her. So, what's your plan? Elena clutched her books tighter. Practice. That's it? Elena, no one learns Rach 3 in 3 weeks, not from scratch. She gave him a small, enigmatic smile. I'm a quick study. Zach shook his head in disbelief. Look, a bunch of us are going to talk to the student council about this. It's not fair what Hargrove's doing. Please don't, Elena said, touching his arm to stop him. I accepted the challenge. I don't want any special treatment. It's not special treatment to ask for a reasonable assignment. Promise me you won't say anything, she insisted, her eyes suddenly intense. This is between me and Professor Hargrove. Zach studied her face, confusion evident in his expression. There's more to this than you're telling me, isn't there? Elena looked away. I need to get to the practice rooms. Thanks for your concern, but I'll be fine. As she walked away, Zach called after her. Room 312 is free most afternoons. Best piano on the 3rd floor. Elena raised a hand in acknowledgement without turning around. She had already chosen her practice space, the small, isolated room, at the end of the hall, where few students ventured because of its distance from the main areas and its older, slightly out-of-tune upright piano. For the next few days, Elena established a new routine. She attended her classes as required, playing with slightly improved but still deliberately limited skill during her piano sessions with Ms. Walsh. Then, the moment classes ended, she disappeared into her chosen practice room and didn't emerge until late in the evening. What happened inside that room remained her secret. She played with the door firmly closed, and if footsteps approached, she would immediately switch from the magnificent complexity of Rachmaninoff to simple exercises or deliberately flawed passages. One evening, nearly a week after the challenge had been issued, the building was almost empty. Most students had left for dinner or social activities. Elena sat alone in her practice room, lost in the sweeping drama of the concerto's first movement. Her fingers danced across the keys with precision and passion that revealed years of rigorous training. Her body swayed slightly with the music, Her face transformed from its usual guarded expression to one of complete absorption. She was so engrossed that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until they were right outside her door. Instantly, her hands faltered, shifting into a simple scale exercise with deliberate mistakes. The door opened to reveal Mr. Patel, the evening janitor with his cleaning cart. He paused, surprised to find a student still practicing. "Sorry to disturb you," he said kindly. "Just doing my rounds." "It's fine," Elena replied, gathering her music as if preparing to leave. Mr. Patel tilted his head, a curious expression on his face. "You know, it's the strangest thing. Sometimes when I'm cleaning this hall, I hear the most beautiful music coming from this room, like a professional concert pianist, but whenever I look in, it's just students practicing." He smiled. "The acoustics in this old building play tricks, I suppose." Elena's hands froze over the keys. "Yes, the acoustics are unusual." Mr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. "My wife loves Rachmaninoff. I recognize that piece you're working on, very difficult." "Very," Elena agreed softly. "Well, don't mind me. Practice as long as you need. I'll come back later." He started to close the door, then paused. "You know, my mother used to say that music isn't just in the fingers, it's in the heart. When you play from your heart, people can tell the difference." After he left, Elena sat motionless at the piano. For the first time since arriving at Westfield, she felt truly seen, not by her professors or fellow students, but by the kind-eyed janitor who cleaned the halls after everyone had gone. She placed her hands back on the keys and began to play again. Not the simplified version she presented to others, but the full, glorious complexity of the piece. This time she didn't stop when she heard footsteps pass by. Meanwhile, in the faculty wing, Professor Hargrove sat in his office reviewing student evaluations. A knock at his door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called, not looking up from his papers. Ms. Walsh entered, her expression troubled. "We need to talk about Elena Chen." Professor Hargrove set down his pen. "What about her?" "This challenge is affecting her. She's barely participating in class discussions anymore. She's in the practice rooms until closing time every night. Some students say she's not even eating meals regularly. Dedication is a requirement at Westfield," he said dismissively. Ms. Walsh sat down across from him. "Richard, there's dedication and then there's cruelty. You've given her an impossible task." "Have I?" He leaned back in his chair. "You know as well as I do that something doesn't add up about that girl. Her technique is too refined for someone with just some lessons growing up. Her posture, her hand position, these things take years to develop properly. So you're trying to force her to reveal. What exactly?" Professor Hargrove steepled his fingers. "I'm not sure yet, but I intend to find out. And if she fails, spectacularly at the evaluation, if she breaks down in front of the entire department, then perhaps she doesn't belong at Westfield after all," he said, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Ms. Walsh stood up. "I hope your curiosity is worth the potential cost to a young musician's confidence." She walked to the door, then turned back. "By the way, I passed the practice rooms on my way here. Someone was playing Rachmaninoff beautifully. I assumed it was Tina Wong preparing for her graduate recital, but when I checked, her room was empty." She left, leaving Professor Hargrove with a thoughtful expression. After a moment, he gathered his coat and headed toward the practice wing. The halls were quiet as he walked, most rooms dark and empty. But from the far end of the third floor he heard it, the unmistakable second movement of Rachmaninoff's third piano concerto, played with surprising sensitivity and technical proficiency. He moved quietly down the hall, following the music to the smallest, most distant practice room. Through the small window in the door, he could see Elena, her face transformed by the music, her body moving with the emotional swells of the piece, her fingers flying across the keys with the assurance of a seasoned performer. Professor Hargrove watched, transfixed. This was not the hesitant average student who sat in his office weeks ago. This was a pianist of remarkable skill and emotional depth. Just as he was about to open the door, Elena suddenly stopped playing and looked up, as if sensing his presence. Their eyes met through the window. For a moment, neither moved. Then Elena quickly gathered her music and began playing a simple exercise, deliberately inserting mistakes. Professor Hargrove's hand dropped from the door handle. He turned and walked away, his expression unreadable. The next day, Elena arrived at her lesson with Ms. Walsh to find Professor Hargrove waiting as well. Her stomach tightened with anxiety. "Miss Chen," Professor Hargrove began without preamble, "how is your preparation for the evaluation coming along?" "I'm working on it, sir," she replied carefully. "I see. And how much of the concerto have you learned so far?" Elena hesitated. "I've been focusing on the first movement." Professor Hargrove nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Ms. Walsh and I were discussing your progress. We thought it might be helpful for you to hear the piece performed properly." He turned to a record player in the corner of the studio. "This is a recording of Vladimir Horowitz performing Rachmaninoff's Third. I suggest you listen carefully." The room filled with the powerful opening of the concerto. Elena sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. Ms. Walsh watched her closely. "Notice the phrasing here, Elena, the way Horowitz builds tension before the release." Elena nodded slightly, still not looking up. As the recording played the exact passage Elena had been practicing the night before, Professor Hargrove observed her hands. They remained still in her lap, but her fingers made almost imperceptible movements as if playing along with the invisible keys. When the movement ended, Professor Hargrove stopped the recording. "What do you think, Miss Chen?" "It's beautiful," she said softly, "indeed, and utterly beyond the capabilities of most pianists, let alone students." He closed the record sleeve. "Your evaluation is in 2 weeks. I expect to see significant progress by then." After they left, Elena remained seated at the piano for a long time, not playing, just thinking. Her carefully constructed facade was cracking. Professor Hargrove suspected something, perhaps even knew something. The question was no longer if she would reveal her true abilities, but when and how. That evening, her roommate Lily noticed Elena sitting on her bed, eyes closed, fingers moving rapidly across an imaginary keyboard. "What are you doing?" Lily asked. Elena's eyes snapped open. "Just thinking through a piece, or without a piano?" "That's weird," Elena smiled faintly. "It's called visualization. Many musicians use it to practice when they can't access their instrument." Lily shrugged. "If you say so. By the way, there's a rumor going around that Professor Hargrove is bringing in some big-shot pianist for master classes next month. Supposedly a former child prodigy from China or something." Elena's face paled. "Did they mention a name? Lynn something? Or maybe Lena? I don't remember." Lily grabbed her coat. "Anyway, I'm heading to dinner." "You coming?" "No," Elena said distantly. "I need to practice." After Lily left, Elena sat frozen on her bed, her heart racing. The walls of her carefully constructed new life were closing in. The time for decisions had come, and she had less time than she thought. The day of the departmental evaluation arrived with an air of anticipation hanging over Westfield Conservatory. What had begun as a routine assessment had transformed into something of a spectacle. Word had spread beyond the piano department that Professor Hargrove had assigned the notoriously difficult Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 3 to a struggling intermediate student. Faculty members from other departments planned to attend, some out of curiosity, others concerned about the ethics of such a challenge. The small recital hall was usually half empty for these evaluations, but today every seat was filled. Piano students sat together in groups, whispering among themselves. Several professors lined the back wall, including Ms. Walsh, who couldn't quite hide her worried expression. Elena arrived early, dressed simply in black pants and a deep blue blouse. She carried no sheet music, no notes, just herself and the weight of her decision. She found a quiet corner backstage and sat alone, eyes closed, fingers moving silently through passages of the concerto. Zach spotted her and approached cautiously. "Hey," Elena opened her eyes. "Hey, everyone's out there," he said, glancing toward the stage. "It's packed." "I know. Are you okay?" "You seem different today." Elena gave him a small smile. "I am different today." Before he could ask what she meant, Professor Hargrove appeared. Miss Chen, you're up after Tina Wong. Be ready in 5 minutes. Elena nodded, and the professor walked away without another word. Whatever happens out there, Zach said, squeezing her shoulder gently. Remember that most of us think this whole thing is unfair. No one expects you to pull off a miracle. Thank you, Elena said quietly. That means a lot. On stage, Tina Wong was finishing her performance of a challenging Liszt piece. The audience applauded appreciatively as she bowed and exited. Professor Hargrove walked to center stage. Our next performer is Elena Chen, a transfer student in the intermediate piano program. She will be performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 in D minor, first movement. A murmur ran through the audience. A faculty member in the back row leaned over to whisper to his colleague, "Is he serious? That's graduate-level repertoire." Elena walked onto the stage, her steps measured and calm. She bowed slightly to the audience, then to Professor Hargrove, who had taken a seat in the front row beside the other piano faculty members. The grand piano waited at center stage, its lid fully open, gleaming under the lights. Elena sat down, adjusting the bench with practiced precision. She took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment she hesitated, and several audience members exchanged glances. Was she freezing up? Had the pressure become too much? Then Elena began to play. The opening theme of Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto emerged, deceptively simple yet hauntingly beautiful. Her touch was delicate but assured, each note perfectly weighted and timed. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just pure, confident musicality. In the front row, Professor Hargrove's eyebrows rose slightly. Ms. Walsh leaned forward in her seat, lips parted in surprise. This was not the playing of the student they had been teaching for weeks. As the piece progressed into its more technically demanding sections, Elena's transformation became even more apparent. Her hands moved across the keyboard with astonishing speed and precision, tackling the complex passages that challenged even seasoned professionals. Her body swayed with the music, completely in sync with the emotional swells of the composition. Where the orchestra would normally accompany, Elena somehow suggested its presence through her playing, adjusting her dynamics and timing to leave space for the phantom instruments. It was as if she had internalized not just the piano part but the entire orchestral score. The audience sat in stunned silence. Several students had their phones out, recording the unexpected display of virtuosity. One professor in the back whispered, "Who is this girl?" In the middle of a particularly demanding passage, Elena closed her eyes, surrendering completely to the music. Her face, usually so guarded, showed every emotion the piece evoked: longing, passion, triumph, tenderness. This wasn't just technical mastery. It was artistic interpretation of the highest order. Professor Hargrove sat motionless, his usual stern expression replaced by one of genuine amazement. Beside him, Ms. Walsh wiped away a tear that had escaped without her permission. As Elena approached the cadenza of the extended solo section that showcased the pianist's technical and interpretive abilities, the atmosphere in the hall became electric. This was where even accomplished pianists sometimes faltered, where the composer had piled challenge upon challenge. Elena attacked it fearlessly. Her fingers flew across the keys in blinding arpeggios, thunderous chords, and delicate trills, all executed with a control and artistry that seemed impossible for someone her age. The piano resonated throughout the hall, filling every corner with sound so rich and complex it seemed to come from multiple instruments. A ripple of spontaneous applause broke out during a brief pause, quickly hushed as Elena continued. The final section of the movement built to its powerful conclusion, and Elena's playing grew even more passionate, driving the music forward with unstoppable momentum. When she struck the final chords, the sound lingered in the air for a moment before the hall erupted. Students leapt to their feet, applauding wildly. Faculty members looked at each other in disbelief before joining the standing ovation. Even Professor Hargrove stood, his expression a mixture of vindication and genuine respect. Elena remained seated at the piano for a moment, her hands still resting on the keys, her breathing heavy from the physical and emotional exertion. Then she stood and offered a modest bow, her eyes finding Professor Hargrove's in the front row. Something passed between them in that gaze. An understanding, perhaps, or a mutual acknowledgement of the truth that had been revealed. As Elena made her way backstage, students and faculty parted to let her through. many reaching out to touch her arm or shoulder in congratulation. The whispers had changed from skepticism to awe. That was Horowitz-level playing. Did you see her hands during that cadenza? How did we not know? How did none of us see this? Zach was waiting for her, his face a picture of shocked delight. Elena, that was... I don't even have words. Why did you hide this? You're not just good, you're world class. Before she could answer, Professor Hargrove appeared, his tall figure commanding immediate attention. Miss Chen, he said, his voice carrying in the suddenly quiet backstage area. I believe you and I need to have a conversation. Elena nodded. Yes, sir. They walked in silence to his office, followed by curious gazes. Once inside, Professor Hargrove closed the door and turned to face her. I suspected there was more to you than you were showing, he said, gesturing for her to sit. But I admit I underestimated just how much more. Elena sat down, her posture still perfect, though some of the tension had left her shoulders now that her secret was out. Why the deception? He asked, taking his seat behind the desk. Why come to Westfield and pretend to be mediocre when you clearly have training at the highest level? Elena looked down at her hands that had just revealed her true self to everyone. I needed a fresh start. Explain. She took a deep breath. My name isn't really Elena Chen, it's Lena Zhen. Professor Hargrove's eyes widened in recognition. The child prodigy from Shanghai, the one who disappeared from the concert circuit 5 years ago. Elena, or rather Lena, nodded. I was 14 when I stopped performing. After winning the International Tchaikovsky competition for young musicians, everything became too much. The pressure, the expectations, the endless touring. I wasn't a person anymore, just a pair of hands that played piano. So you walked away, Professor Hargrove said, understanding dawning in his eyes. My parents didn't understand. They had sacrificed everything for my career. When I said I wanted to stop, to be normal, to go to school like other kids, it caused a huge rift. She looked up at him. I came to America to live with my aunt. Changed my name. Applied to colleges like a regular student. But why Westfield? Why put yourself back into the pressure cooker of a top conservatory? A small smile touched her lips. Because despite everything, I love music. I couldn't imagine my life without it. But I wanted to learn on my own terms, to find joy in playing again, not just technical perfection. Professor Hargrove leaned back in his chair, processing this revelation. And the charade? The deliberate mistakes? I didn't want special treatment. I didn't want to be the prodigy again. I just wanted to be another student, learning and growing without the weight of my past following me. The professor was quiet for a long moment. You realize what happened today changes everything? Your performance will be all over social media by dinner time. Lena nodded. I know. That's why I decided to play at my real level. I was tired of hiding, tired of holding back. When you assigned me the Rachmaninoff, it was almost a relief, like you were giving me permission to be myself again. A knock at the door interrupted them. Ms. Walsh entered without waiting for a response. Her face flushed with excitement. Richard, the faculty is buzzing. Everyone's asking. She stopped when she saw Lena. Elena, that was the most extraordinary playing I've ever heard from a student. Why didn't you tell us? Professor Hargrove gestured to the other chair. Patricia, meet Lena Zhen, former winner of the Tchaikovsky competition and apparently our newest student in need of a completely revamped curriculum. Ms. Walsh's jaw dropped. The Lena Zhen? But you disappeared years ago. The music world thought you'd quit playing altogether. That was the idea, Lena said softly. As Ms. Walsh sat down, still processing this information, Professor Hargrove turned back to Lena. The question now is, what happens next? By the next morning, videos of Lena's performance had spread across social media. Students who hadn't attended the evaluation watched in awe as the quiet transfer student they'd barely noticed transformed into a world-class pianist before their eyes. Local music blogs picked up the story, and by afternoon, even national arts publications were running headlines about the return of child prodigy Lena Zhen. Lena sat in Professor Hargrove's office, surrounded by the conservatory's leadership team. The Dean of Music, Dr. Reynolds, a distinguished composer with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward in his chair. Miss Zhen, or do you prefer Chen? He asked gently. Chen is fine, she said quietly. I think that part of my life is back now, whether I planned it or not. Dr. Reynolds nodded. We're facing an unusual situation. Your abilities clearly place you among our most advanced students, yet you deliberately enrolled as an intermediate student under a different name. I understand if you want me to leave, Lena said, hands folded in her lap. I did mislead the school. Professor Hargrove, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. That won't be necessary. All eyes turned to him in surprise. Richard? Dr. Reynolds questioned. Ms. Jen came here to learn, not to deceive us for personal gain, Professor Hargrove said firmly. Her methods were unconventional, but her goal was legitimate. She wanted to study music without the burden of her reputation. Ms. Walsh nodded in agreement. I've reviewed her application essays again. She never actually lied about her abilities. She simply described herself as having some training and experience playing at home. Technically accurate, if dramatically understated. A small smile crossed Lena's face at this generous interpretation. Dr. Reynolds considered this. Well, the question remains, what do we do now? We can hardly place you back in intermediate classes. If I may, Lena said, her voice stronger than before, I'd like to propose something. The faculty members exchanged glances but nodded for her to continue. I came to Westfield because I wanted to rebuild my relationship with music. For years, piano was just work. Endless hours of technical drills, competitions, performances. I lost the joy. She paused, choosing her words carefully. What I realized during these past weeks, especially when preparing the Rachmaninoff, was that I still love playing. But I need to learn how to play for myself again, not just for judges or audiences. Professor Hargrove leaned forward, intrigued. What are you suggesting? A customized program, Lena replied. One that includes advanced performance studies, yes, but also music education, composition, theory. Areas I never got to explore because I was too busy performing. I want to become a complete musician, not just a technical marvel. The room fell silent as the faculty considered her proposal. It's unprecedented, Dr. Reynolds mused. So is having a former international competition winner hiding in our intermediate piano class, Ms. Walsh pointed out with a wry smile. Professor Hargrove stood and walked to the window looking out over the campus. I believe we can accommodate Miss Jen's request. In fact, I think it could benefit the entire conservatory. How so? Asked Dr. Reynolds. The professor turned back to the room. While continuing her studies, Miss Jen could work with other students, not as a formal teacher, but as a peer mentor. Her insights would be invaluable, especially to those struggling with performance anxiety or technical challenges. Lena looked up in surprise. You trust me to do that? After I deceived you? Professor Hargrove's expression softened slightly, the closest he ever came to a smile. You didn't deceive us out of malice or laziness. You were trying to find your way back to music on your own terms. That's something many of our students could learn from. Outside Professor Hargrove's office, a small crowd of students had gathered, waiting for news. Zach paced nervously, while others sat on the floor playing games on their phones or quietly discussing the previous day's shocking revelation. When the door finally opened, all eyes turned to Lena as she emerged. For a moment, no one spoke. So, Zach finally asked, Are you staying? Lena nodded, a genuine smile spreading across her face. I'm staying. The hallway erupted in cheers and applause. Students who had barely spoken to her before rushed forward with congratulations and questions. For the first time since arriving at Westfield, Lena didn't shrink away from the attention. Is it true you won the Tchaikovsky at 13? Someone asked. 12, actually, she admitted with none of her former hesitation. Will you play for us again? The real you this time? Lena laughed, a sound few had heard from her before. I think I've done enough performing for now. But soon, yes, Professor Hargrove appeared in the doorway. All right, that's enough excitement for one day. Miss Jen has a new curriculum to prepare for, and the rest of you have regular classes to attend. As the students dispersed, Zach hung back. So, Lena, huh? Not Elena. Lena Jen, she confirmed. Sorry for not being honest with you. Are you kidding? Finding out my friend is secretly a famous pianist is the coolest thing that's happened all year. He grinned. Though it does explain why you always beat me at rhythm games in the student lounge. Lena's laughter echoed down the hall as they walked together toward the practice rooms. Over the following weeks, Westfield Conservatory adjusted to having a celebrity in their midst. Lena's custom program took shape under the guidance of Professor Hargrove, who seemed to have found a new purpose in mentoring this exceptional student. To everyone's surprise, the stern professor and the formerly withdrawn prodigy developed a strong working relationship based on mutual respect. One afternoon, about a month after the revelation, Lena sat in Professor Hargrove's studio, discussing a composition she was working on, another new area for her. "Your harmonic progression here is interesting," he noted, pointing to a section of her score. "Unconventional, but it works. Who influenced this approach?" "Honestly, video game soundtracks," Lena admitted. "During those years I wasn't performing, I played a lot of games. The music stayed with me." Professor Hargrove raised an eyebrow but nodded thoughtfully. "All musical influences are valid if they inspire creativity, though perhaps we should add some Debussy to your listening assignments as well." A knock at the door interrupted them. Ms. Walsh entered, looking excited. "Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you both should see this." She handed Professor Hargrove a music magazine. "Page 12. He flipped to the page and read silently, his expression unreadable. Then he passed the magazine to Lena. It was a feature article titled "The Return of Lena Zhen on Her Own Terms." The piece detailed her surprise performance at Westfield and included quotes from music critics and former teachers praising her artistic growth and maturity. "They're calling your interpretation of Rachmaninoff revelatory," Ms. Walsh said. "The video has over 2 million views online." Lena set the magazine down, her feelings mixed. "I didn't do this for publicity." "Of course not," Professor Hargrove agreed. "But your journey resonates with people. Many young musicians struggle with burnout and the pressure of expectations. Your story gives them hope." Lena considered this. "I never thought of it that way." "There's something else," Ms. Walsh added. "We've received inquiries from several orchestras. They're interested in having you perform as a guest soloist." Lena's eyes widened. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "You don't have to decide now," Professor Hargrove said. "Take your time. Focus on your studies. The music world has waited 5 years for Lena Zhen's return. It can wait a bit longer." That evening, Lena found herself drawn to the small practice room at the end of the third-floor hallway, the room where she had first allowed herself to play freely again. It was empty, just as she hoped. She sat at the upright piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. This humble instrument had witnessed her private struggle and ultimate decision to reclaim her identity. As she began to play, not Rachmaninoff or any other virtuosic showpiece, but a simple, beautiful Chopin nocturne, Mr. Patel, the janitor paused outside the door. He listened for a moment, smiling to himself, then continued his rounds, leaving her to commune with the music in peace. In the weeks that followed, Lena found a new balance in her life. She continued her studies at Westfield, excelling in her customized program while gradually accepting more opportunities to perform, but always on her own terms. She began working with younger students, particularly those struggling with performance anxiety, sharing her own experiences and techniques for finding joy in music again. Professor Hargrove, watching her blossom into not just a virtuoso, but a complete musician with a voice of her own, found himself reflecting on his role in her journey. His challenge, intended to expose what he perceived as deception, had instead helped Lena rediscover her authentic self. 6 months after her revealing performance, Lena gave her first public recital under her real name. The program included traditional classical masterworks alongside her own compositions, pieces that reflected her unique journey. From child prodigy to independent artist, Professor Hargrove sat in the front row, Ms. Walsh beside him. As Lena walked onto the stage, she paused to look at them, a silent acknowledgement of their role in her transformation. "She's come so far," Ms. Walsh whispered. Professor Hargrove nodded. "No, she's come back to herself. Sometimes the longest journey is the one that leads us home." As Lena began to play, her posture perfect, her expression serene, her music flowing with both technical brilliance and genuine emotion, the audience fell under her spell. But unlike in her childhood performances, she wasn't playing to impress them or to win their approval. She was playing for herself, and that made all the difference. In that moment, as music filled the hall, both student and teachers knew that what had begun as a challenge had become a gift. By forcing Lena to play that difficult piano piece, Professor Hargrove hadn't just discovered a prodigy, he had helped her rediscover herself.